What's up, guys? Welcome into the Fireside Bears YouTube channel. Usayd, Coach, and Max Smith here. You can follow us on Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram at Fireside Bears. You can follow myself and Max on Twitter at Max Smith ESM and at Usayd Coach. Max, we got a lot going on. We got Matt Eberflus getting a second interview. We got Byron Leftwich getting his first interview. And then Nathaniel Hacket, too. Not necessarily an afterthought, but a really intriguing name to monitor. But how you doing, man?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm excited that this list is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. We see a lot of rumors coming from other teams, such as the Texans or the Giants about, or even the Dolphins, really, about, X went well with this interview, or this went well, or the Giants are really looking at somebody. We haven't really seen anything like that from Halas Hall yet, which kind of speaks to how airtight this process is and how small and intimate this is in Halas Hall. It seems like there's really only a few people in the room where it happens. We know exactly who those people are. And we're not really learning a lot outside of who's being invited to interview with the Bears and exactly who these people are. So that makes me excited because, one, that tells me that Bears are doing their homework, right? They're trying to bring in as many possible voices as they humanly can, and they're doing a great job of that. And number two, it tells me that they're not worried, right? That they're taking their time and that, yeah, sure, some of these guys may already have offers from other organizations, but because of the position that the Bears are in right now, their offer is going to be a million times more alluring than, say, an offer from the Texans or, say, an offer from the Dolphins. And I'd even argue, say, an offer from the Raiders, but that's certainly up for debate. So, yeah, today we're going to be taking a look at Matt Eberflus, defensive coordinator. I was going to say former defensive coordinator. He still has his job with the Indianapolis Colts. Byron Leftwich, who's the offensive coordinator for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers as they look to make it to the NFC Championship for a second straight year. And then Nathaniel Hacket, who's also looking to potentially make the NFC Championship for another year with the Green Bay Packers. Now, there's a lot of different opinions on all these guys, but we're going to start off with the defensive-minded guy first. That's Matt Eberflus from Indiana. He's already getting his second interview, which is incredibly interesting to me because we haven't even seen GMs get their second interview requests yet. But Halas Hall has made it very clear that they're going to hire a GM before they bring in the head coach. So what do you make out of this?
Well, it's a bit of a confusing process because, when you talk about hiring a general manager before hiring a head coach, you would think that that's the way things are traditionally supposed to go. So the Bears are making it seem like they're doing something out of the ordinary, which, again, they're certainly not. I do want a GM in place first because I think that you need to have a general manager whose football philosophy, as well as mindset, as well as skill set, aligns with that of the head coach. It would be like, you bringing in a guy like a Matt Eberflus for your head coach and pairing him with someone like Jeff Ireland. Now, the problem with that is you have two people that have completely different philosophies, right? So when we look at what's going on at Halas Hall, I have to say, it's just something where it's just like continue to be patient because, again, good things come to those who wait. And the Bears have certainly shown us in the past that when they rush hires, that 3 to 4 years down the road, it certainly tends to mess up more than we're willing to admit. Now, I think shifting the conversation over to Matt Eberflus and his second interview, I think it's interesting because he interviewed for the Bears position on Monday, January 17th, I believe. And so he has to be a really strong candidate if he's getting a second interview, getting called back for a second interview just 3 to 4 days later. That means that I think that's something to keep an eye on because it's showing us that Eberflus could be one of the few front runners for this job. But we also have to keep something in mind is that the Bears aren't done interviewing. While we're seeing Eberflus get a second interview, I think the organization's telling him, hey, we're legitimately interested in you. But then you have these guys like Byron Leftwich, like Todd Bowles, for example, like a Leslie Frazier that haven't had the opportunity yet to even get their first interviews, or even Brian Dable. He's gotten a first interview, but not a second interview. So keep an eye on Eberflus.
Yeah, Matt Eberflus is definitely an interesting guy. There's not a lot of people that may know him. He's not a really flashy name, but his coaching resume speaks for itself. I think Bears giving him a second look is definitely a good sign for him. It also, to me, says they're worried that he's looking at another offer. There are reports coming out of Jacksonville that he's one of the front runners, if not the front runner, for the Jaguars at the moment. He met with Sidir Khan in Jacksonville. So maybe that's Halas Hall getting a little bit nervous that one of their top guys is already looking at another offer from Jacksonville. So maybe they could bring him back in, try to figure out what he would like from the GM position. Because, you know, that is interesting to me that if you're going to bring in a head coach without bringing in a GM first, that tells me that the head coach is going to have a say in who the general manager is going to be, which is interesting because traditionally the general manager is in charge of the head coach, at least in an organizational tree. So that is really interesting to me to consider that. Now, I'm not totally against the idea of Matt Eberflus. I've been saying this before, and I wouldn't be disappointed with it as well. Sam Stevenson, who's on the pod, he's been on the show a couple times. He's shared his sentiment on Twitter as well. Eberflus wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. And let me tell you why. The guy gets results from his players. The Indianapolis Colts have had one of the best defenses, full stop, in the NFL since Matt Eberflus has taken over. His time in Dallas was fruitful. Dallas had incredible defensive talent from the linebacker position that Matt Eberflus was in charge of. The man just performs, and he does incredibly well with what he has and what he is given. And when we've been talking about head coaches on this show since episode 1, 2, and here we are in episode 3, one theme that's been consistent is the absence of what Matt Nagy did, which was put okay players in elite positions, right? Making the most out of the roster that you are given. And Matt Eberflus was able to do that incredibly well. It's not like there is a bunch of, heavy hitter round the clock all-stars on the Colts. Now there's a couple for sure, but that's a roster that's really well put together and executed by their coordinator. So I'm not surprised that the Bears are giving another look at Eberflus. That being said, there's two defensive head coaches that are obviously at the top of the list for the Chicago Bears, Leslie Frazier, which we're going to talk about here next. Just a little bit because we covered him pretty intensely over in episode 1. And I'll put a little thing up here for you can watch that if you haven't. But I'd rather have Matt Eberflus than Leslie Frazier. And I say that only because Eberflus hasn't had that experience as a head coach, and that kind of makes me excited because when we look at Leslie Frazier's head coach tenure, it wasn't great, right? So there's a little bit concerns there. Leslie Frazier just doesn't get me as excited as Eberflus does. And I didn't say to begin with that Leslie Frazier would be a bad hire because it's not. If you go with either of these guys, I still think it's a good hire. But it doesn't get me as excited as a concept of Eberflus, who's a studded defensive coordinator that has the opportunity to really make his coaching roster and really mold this defense into the next iteration of professional defenses in the league, because that's what he's good at. And if we're looking at innovation yet with a little bit of old Bears swagger, I think a really good new age defensive coordinator would be perfect for that position. But that's just my take.
And I want to add something on about Matt Eberflus, because something that we're not talking about enough is that I think he's a great defensive coordinator. But you look at the Colts draft history since 2017 when Chris Ballard took over. Now, there's something to note too, is that Eberflus got there in 2018 with Frank Reich. But when you look at that all-time draft history, you realize that Chris Ballard has selected just two defensive players in the first round. One being Malik Hooker, and the second being Kwity Paye. Hooker was 2017. Paye was in 2021. And so ultimately, that's really worth consideration, because when we look at some of the top players on this defense, take a Darius Leonard. He was a second-round pick. Take a Rock Ya-Sin, a second-round pick. Take Julian Blackmon, third-round pick. When we look at that, we're immediately seeing a trend that Matt Eberflus has proven that he doesn't need a high pick necessarily, or a top 5 or a top 10 or even a first round pick to succeed when it comes to building a great defense. He's able to do that and get the best out of a lot of these players no matter where they're drafted. And that really warrants some consideration, because when you talk about the Bears job, one thing that we also have to understand is that this defense is going to undergo some rebuilding over the next couple seasons. I mean, and the Bears are at a point where Khalil Mack and Robert Quinn are getting older. Eddie Jackson's getting older. You have Roquan Smith and Jalen Johnson as your sole building blocks. And then you do have some talent with players like Thomas Graham Jr. You look at and you're like, okay, Matt Eberflus is the head coach that can make them go from being average to good to great to even elite. And then you look at some of these other players, like let's just say the Bears opt to bring back Bilal Nichols this year. Maybe Bilal Nichols can have a revival year because he just needs a breath of fresh air. And so when we talk about Eberflus, I think that so many people get caught up in the fact that, well, it's the Colts. Well, they haven't won a lot of games. At the end of the day, though, having Matt Eberflus be a head coach isn't 50% of it's what he's done with the Colts. The other 50% of it is what he's done on an individual level with a lot of these players in the Colts. You know what? They do have one of the better defenses in the NFL. I understand that there's people out there that are going to talk about, well, his red zone defense, sometimes the defense breaks down in the fourth quarter, but I also think you have to throw this into the ring too. Is that not every candidate's going to be perfect, and there's no perfect head coach out there. And so you're playing with the lesser of kind of two evils, right? In terms of Matt Eberflus or someone else. Now, I will say regarding Eberflus, if you bring him in, and I'm going to let you chime in after this, if you bring Matt Eberflus in, there's a big question that gets raised, which is who is then responsible for the development of Justin Fields? And that would more than likely be the offensive coordinator as well as quarterbacks coach that Eberflus opts to bring in.
Yeah, 100%. That's a great point. Is even when you look at Leslie Frazier or any of the defensive-minded head coaching prospects, is who's going to be in charge of Justin Fields and this young, great core of offense that the last regime really put a lot of effort into building. And the answer is what you just said, whoever they decide to lead, right? And that's obviously a point of contention in the interview process. 100% is they're asking these guys, who exactly would you be interested in bringing in? Because obviously front office needs to verify that as well. So and I just want to piggyback off what you were talking about, individual development under Eberflus. I mean, Darius Leonard, right? This man is an absolute stud. He's a second round pick. And under leadership from Eberflus and that culture, right, that he was able to provide in Indianapolis. Darius Leonard was rookie of the year and is, you know, one of the best defensive players in the NFL right now, right? So, you know, you look at Yasin Bey and all these other great guys that the Indianapolis Colts have, and it's not like they were coming out of college that were super coveted. I mean, like the second round draft pick's pretty good, right? But like you just said, there's not a whole lot of meat there for him to work with. And I think that when we're talking about individual development, that is absolutely crucial from the head coaching position. But his track record speaks for himself. Take a second, if you'd like, go to Matt Eberflus's Pro Football Reference, look at some of the rushing defense grades that this guy has over his tenure, and look at just some of the overall defensive grades that he turns defenses around, right? And that's what his whole shtick is. And I think he'd be great here in Chicago. It would just be really interesting in seeing how he works with Sean Desai, right? I think that would be a definite area of contention for the front office to look at. Is does Sean like this guy? You know, are they going to have a really good working relationship, or what is that going to look like down the line if you bring in Eberflus or a guy like Leslie Frazier? But that's all good points. So we're going to stop the defensive candidates there, and we're going to hop over to the offensive candidates in today's, which is Byron Leftwich and Nathaniel Hacket. I'm going to start off with Byron because I think this is an incredibly interesting name that I don't think would have gone up in stock at all this year if it wasn't for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers finding another year of renewed success. I personally thought Todd Bowles was the name to look at from this trio of Bruce Arians, Byron Leftwich, and Todd Bowles in this coaching trio. I thought people would have looked at Todd as another potential, you know, hot head coaching candidate. But here we are looking at Byron Leftwich. It's probably because he doesn't have the experience that Todd Bowles does, but here we are. Byron Leftwich is definitely an interesting character because when we're looking at Nathaniel Hacket and Byron Leftwich, we're looking also at Tom Brady and Aaron Rodgers, right? We're looking at offenses that are star-studded, that have performed consistently, that also have head coaches that were former offensive coordinators or offensive gurus themselves. So you have to put a little bit of caveat there because you're wondering, right, exactly how much of them is their success? How much can they claim as their own? But they're also surrounded by all this talent. So the other side of the coin is how much are they learning from some of these geniuses, right? Like how much has Byron Leftwich learned from Bruce Arians? How much has he learned from Tom Brady and Brady's time with Josh McDaniels? So this is really interesting question for me and this is one that fans pose on Twitter all the time is how much of the success is theirs?
Sorry, I'm also chowing down on my taco dinner here.
I get it.
I just recorded because I have 3 other shows to do after this, including one that I did earlier while keeping up with our friend of the show, Adam Rank, on Twitter. We'll get Adam on sometime so we can compare Avengers to Bears players. But anyways, you know, Leftwich is very interesting, and I think the same can be said for Nathaniel Hacket, who we'll get to in a moment here, because what you're dealing with when it comes to both of these coordinators is, hey, is it legitimately the coordinator or is it the Hall of Fame, or I should say future Hall of Fame quarterback that they have at their disposal? And, a bit of it for me comes down to the fact that I do think that Byron Leftwich is legit, because we also have to understand something is that Byron Leftwich made a guy like a Carson Palmer look good in Arizona, and he made the Cardinals offense look really good. So yeah, he kind of lucked into a Hall of Fame quarterback with Brady deciding to leave New England and then sign with Tampa Bay. But there's also something to be said is if you remember those Cardinals teams back in 2014, 15, 16, they were a really good team. And Byron Leftwich was kind of one of the driving forces behind some of those potent offenses. Because I think a lot of people tend to forget, like, the Cardinals were good with Ken Whisenhunt, and then they really fell off. And then all of a sudden, it was almost like, oh yeah, you know what? We're gonna go ahead and we're gonna get the best out of these guys. And I think Leftwich's work in 2017, and then obviously, with the Cards in 2018 soon kind of was a horrendous year. He really's taken off with Tom Brady, but he had some phenomenal work. And I think when it comes to Leftwich, we also have to understand is that he's been damn good when it comes to being able to get the best out of any quarterback. So I would say he's a quarterback guru, and he doesn't only understand how to develop, he understands how to coach too. And so when we talk about developing coaching the quarterback position, I don't think there's a top mind in the NFL like there is Byron Leftwich.
Yeah, I want to agree with that on multiple levels. Byron Leftwich played in the league for a long time. Who else to know the quarterback position than a guy who lived it with several different teams? I think if we're looking at a name that's going to be the most developmental to Justin Fields, I think it's Byron Leftwich. I think if anyone's like a diehard Justin Fields fan, as most Bear fans are, then this is your guy. I think if there's anyone that's going to lead this offense to success, it's going to be Byron Leftwich. I love Brian Dable, don't get me wrong, but I think Byron Leftwich is just better suited to develop Justin Fields into the future quarterback of the NFL. And I think he has every tool necessary to make that happen. Something I want to point out with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and Byron Leftwich is the fact that this was a completely different scheme for Tom Brady. And he's gone on record saying that Bruce Arians and Byron Leftwich didn't make it easy for him. They gave him an entire new playbook. They told him to completely change how you read downfield. They even had him change his cadence and his snap, right? They basically asked him to completely change how you play quarterback over the past, decade or the entire time I've been alive, and said, hey, we're going to tell you how to play quarterback now here in Tampa Bay under Arians and Leftwich. And it works, right? Outside of that incident that happened week 1 last year against the Saints, Tom Brady has looked just as good, if not better, than he has in other iterations. Now, I will put a caveat on that because why Tom Brady looks so good may not be because of his physical attributes, but maybe because of how well the offense is schemed around him, right? So Tom Brady gets bailed out a lot. The Buccaneers get bailed out a lot by what? Really good play design. Byron Leftwich relies heavily on good tight ends. We've seen that with Cameron Brate and Rob Gronkowski, right? So we could potentially see guys like Cole Kmet find increased usage. Chris Godwin, right? He was a name that really wasn't that popular across the NFL, but he's very much like a Darnell Mooney. There's a lot of parallels between this offense in Tampa Bay and what the Chicago Bears have on the field that could draw incredibly well for Byron Leftwich as he enters a new roster. This Tampa Bay Buccaneers offense is stacked because they've been able to pull the best out of their players. They've made players household names. And I think that's something that Byron Leftwich brings to the Chicago Bears if they bring him on. So I really, really, really like the idea of Byron Leftwich as head coach of the Chicago Bears, specifically for the development of Justin Fields and some of these guys on the offense. on the flip side of the coin, he's not super well plugged into the defensive side of the world. I'm sure he has connections. But that's when you really have to put trust and stock in Sean Desai and any of these offensive-minded head coaches is how well do we trust our defensive staff right now to make sure that they build upon what happened last year. But no, I really like Byron Leftwich.
Yeah, see, I want to add something on regarding Byron Leftwich because something we need to discuss is, you're right, the defensive side of the ball. Now, I certainly think it's possible that there is someone on Todd Bowles' staff that
Sure.
Byron Leftwich is looking at and is saying, hey, you know what? We want you to come over to Chicago. I want you to come over to Chicago with me so that you can be the defensive coordinator. And right off the bat, when you do go look at that list, I mean, there's a couple really interesting names. I would say that the outside linebackers coach, Larry Foote, is certainly an interesting one. And, if you guys remember, for those of our older listeners, Larry Foote did play with the Steelers as well as the Cardinals and Lions. And he was someone that, really played the game at a high level. And back in the early 2000s, I mean, he was someone that, defenses had to legitimately game plan. So from the perspective of being able to consistently kind of get the best out of your players, I would definitely say that Larry Foote is a name to keep an eye on. And then also, I believe that there's a couple intriguing other names around the league too. Well, on the Buccaneers staff, like take, for example, a Casey Rogers, right, who's been the Buccaneers defensive line coach since 2019. And then obviously, he did work for about 3 to 4 seasons under Todd Bowles with the New York Jets as a defensive coordinator. And so ultimately, when you look at it, I think that Byron Leftwich, knowing the connections he has and knowing how close that trio of Bowles, Bruce Arians, and Leftwich is, that I don't think Leftwich is going to have an issue bringing in a defensive coordinator if he does make an external hire. But I will say, I think the single biggest advantage to taking the Bears gig is that you can always convince Sean Desai to stay and then just have that continuity on the defensive side of the ball. Because have I said the Bears need to rebuild the defense? Yeah. But I think if 2021 showed us anything, it's that the Bears are not as far off from a total rebuild on defense as some people out there assume. There's still more than enough juice left in this tank for this to be a well-oiled machine. You factor that in with getting a healthy Khalil Mack back, another year of Roquan Smith, development for Jalen Johnson, and you could be looking at a really solid unit. It's just the defense right now just needs a couple tweaks here and there.
Yeah, no, you're completely right. In the Buccaneers, outside linebacker, they have one of the best outside linebackers / defensive line core in the league. Just look at what Shaq Barrett was able to do in 2020 now. The years are still messed up to me. No, you're completely right. I mean, there's just a lot of reasons to like Byron Leftwich. That's why he's one of the biggest names on this carousel right now. And I took us a while to interview to request him. And there's another name out there in Kellen Moore that the Bears haven't even looked at yet. Not sure if we ever will. But it reminds me a lot of Byron Leftwich. But I feel as if though Byron Leftwich has more to provide than Kellen Moore does. So I'm if there's a pick right now that I think is my number 2 outside of Brian Flores, is certainly Byron Leftwich. And I only say that because I still wish Jim Harbaugh, but I don't think that's going to happen anymore, unfortunately. But that leads us to our last guy, Nathaniel Hacket. He's currently the offensive coordinator for the Green Bay Packers. Would be an interesting move to poach the OC from our friends up north. But what does Nathaniel Hacket bring to Page? So apologies, I'm looking at notes here. He's offensive coordinator for the Green Bay Packers from 2019 till today. So he's had some offensive success with Matt LaFleur. We looked at 2016 and 2018. He was the offensive coordinator for the Jacksonville Jaguars. So back when Saxonville was a thing, they were good for about a year. He was there. And then prior to that, he was with the Buffalo Bills from 2013 to 2014. So his first real years of success were with the Jacksonville Jaguars in 2017. And then the past 2 years with Green Bay. Again, we're looking at another situation where this is a guy who's with a future, I think it's just safe to say, Hall of Fame caliber quarterback. And the question is, how much of this is him? How much of this is Aaron Rodgers? I want to really point out the Jordan Love game against Kansas City. I think if there's anything that's going to shoot Nathaniel Hacket in the foot, as well as Jordan Love, as well as Packers fans, is the Jordan Love game against Kansas City. your best guy, Aaron Rodgers, is out of the game, and you're barely able to move the ball, right? Sure, it's Jordan Love's first career start. Sure, against, a former Super Bowl caliber team that's still in the playoffs right now. But the question is, you're a good coach, right? You're supposed to be able to make your offense click well. And we looked at guys like Cliff Kingsbury down in Arizona. Kyler Murray's out for a couple of games, but the team is still clicking on all cylinders. They're still putting up points. Maybe they aren't winning games, but they're still moving the ball. They're still putting points on the scoreboard. So for me, that makes me a little bit cautious. Is when Aaron Rodgers is out of the game, the Packers don't move the ball very well.
Well, look, that Kansas City Green Bay game, you're certainly right. I mean, it is a red flag on Nathaniel Hackett's resume, but I also think what is intriguing when it comes to Nathaniel Hackett is that Aaron Rodgers has given him a ringing endorsement in the past. And mind you, Aaron Rodgers is someone that, for as long as I've covered him and watched all his press conferences, things of that nature, Aaron Rodgers is not someone who you get a ringing endorsement from unless you are the elephant in the room. Because when we look at some of the stuff Aaron Rodgers has said on the Pat McAfee show, which it seems like he's a regular on that show, he says this is a little overdue, to be honest. He's been around the game a long time. What he did in Jacksonville, I think, was pure magic, getting them within a quarter of the Super Bowl. He's a great coach. I love spending time with him. He's a fantastic teacher. He's incredible in front of the room. And so when you look at that, you realize that maybe the Hackett praise as well as the Hackett hype, we should call it, is legitimately warranted, because people remember in 2017, I mean, everyone was ready to move on from Blake Bortles, and in comes Nathaniel Hackett and just some way, somehow kind of gets a pretty good season out of Bortles and makes that offense serviceable to the point where he's ready to go to the Super Bowl. But I also want to talk about this, right? Because when you bring the Chiefs-Packers game up, there's a couple things you have to keep in mind. Number one, it was Jordan Love's first start, so we can't knock on Jordan Love too much. But number two, if you go back and you watch that game, you have to realize is that Green Bay needed to employ a pass-first offense because they also knew that they couldn't run the ball, which has traditionally been a strength of Nathaniel Hackett's, because that's what he did in Jacksonville in 2017. Running game and strong defense. But they had to run the ball specifically because they knew and understood you can't, you have to go pass happy against the Chiefs, because what's going to happen is they're going to rack up points on you in bunches. And you know what? Running the ball, keeping out of Patrick Mahomes' hands is fine, but it doesn't matter because that offense is so explosive. They can march down the field in 6 or 7 plays and do so in like 3 to 4 minutes.
Yeah, a testament to Nathaniel Hackett, and I'll give credit where credit is due, is the development of A.J. Dillon as a viable running back in the NFL. The Packers have put together a pretty good run game with really, again, little, I guess, to start with. A.J. Dillon has really come out of nowhere, and I think he's going to be a serviceable running back for the next couple of seasons for the Green Bay Packers because of the development and because of the run schemes that Nathaniel Hackett has been able to develop. When it comes to guys like Aaron Rodgers, I guess, you don't really scheme that. I feel like it's just pure talent at certain points. There's instances where you can put everything, you kitchen sink defense-wise, into the guy's face, and he's going to find a way to make a play happen. He's going to find a way to break your heart. But when it comes down to the run game, when it comes down to putting guys like A.J. Dillon in positions to succeed, Nathaniel Hackett does that. He does that incredibly well. And there's a testament as to why Blake Bortles signed with the Packers during the COVID drama and has been kind of a regular in Green Bay in the offseason as kind of like a practice squad guy. I think that might speak to his relationship with Nathaniel Hackett. So this guy's a quarterback whisperer. Wherever he goes, he makes friends with quarterbacks. Correct me if I'm wrong, but he had a year with Kyle Orton in Buffalo. So maybe there's that Bears connection if we were looking for one. But yeah, no, I don't love the hiring. I really don't. Like the guy has positives for sure. The guy has a good resume, not as strong as some other guys. But I think that question mark just carries with him, and I think that's something that I'm sure that people are thinking about in Halas Hall is how much of his success is his versus Matt's versus Aaron's. He can 100% take credit for the run game, and I think he should. But at this point, I don't think we need another run first or run heavy offensive coordinator. I think we need a guy who's really going to help us flesh out the passing game. And yeah, you can look at the Packers passing game and you can say, look at all these numbers. These are great numbers. The Packers have a fantastic passing game. Well, of course they do. It's Aaron Rodgers, right? I mean, look at this guy. Look at Matt LaFleur. Look at some of these. It's just like, come on. Like, let's. I don't want to put all this credit on Nathaniel Hacket because it's really hard to do. But that's just, I don't know. I could be completely wrong, and I probably am, but I'm not going to budge on this hill. I'm telling you right now, this isn't the guy that I think we should bring in. I'm sure he'd be good friends. I'm sure he'd do well with Justin Fields, but he just doesn't give me that X factor, I think, that I'm looking for, you know?
Yeah, look, you know what happens every single year is there is a coordinator or a position coach who is doing incredibly well because the team's doing well, and it's the product of the head coach or some really good players. Cough, cough. Matt Nagy under Andy Reid and Alex Smith and the Kansas City Chiefs.
Yeah.
Okay, and then that coordinator, all of a sudden gets thrown into the head coaching search simply because people believe that that guy's the driving force behind everything, and that ultimately, at the end of the day, that coordinator's upside is so high it warrants being a head coach. Now we have to keep something in mind, okay, is that the system they're running in Green Bay is not the Nathaniel Hackett offense. Nathaniel Hackett is merely there to coach and install and implement it. It is really Matt LaFleur's system. And by the way, Matt LaFleur gets his influences from Kyle Shanahan and Sean McVay and Mike Shanahan. So ultimately, Matt LaFleur's kind of perfected running his version of the offense, and Nathaniel Hackett is just there. So if you're looking for someone to develop Justin Fields, Nathaniel Hackett makes sense. But at the end of the day, we have to understand something, is that the Bears are not going to win a Super Bowl solely by developing Justin Fields. The Bears are going to win a Super Bowl if they have a well-rounded offense, okay? Because how many times have we seen teams in the NFL develop the quarterback position, but then fail to build around the quarterback and do so properly? And as a result, what happens is the fact that, they get to the playoffs every single year, but they are never able to get over the hump, okay? The Chiefs were a classic example of that. They had a really good roster, but the quarterback wasn't that good under Alex Smith. It was above average, couldn't really get them over the hump. And as a result, kaboom, look what happened, okay? Aaron Rodgers under the twilight years of Mike McCarthy was another one in the Packers. They had everything. They had the quarterback in place, but outside of that, they really didn't have much, okay, to warrant being able to get to the Super Bowl and get over the hump. And so ultimately, when you look at Hackett, you know what? You also have to look at this, is if the Bears are looking to hire someone who's going to make the most of this current roster and the current playmakers on offense, guess what? Hackett's philosophy, along with his personnel groupings, and this is where it gets a bit technical, but the philosophy, the personnel groupings, the types of players the Bears have, they don't necessarily fit this run first offense that Hackett would want to run. Okay. The Bears feature more of players such as Kmet and Mooney that would be really good in the vertical offense. So you're looking at not necessarily Matt Nagy's West Coast spread type offense, but you're looking at something that has a lethal downfield passing attack that can also go side to side with electric speed and playmakers.
Right. Yeah. Great technical breakdown to just my heebie-jeebies. I just don't feel this is the right guy to bring in. Yeah, completely right. Nothing to say there outside of it comes down to personnel, comes down to philosophy, and I'm sure that this man is a great leader of men. I'm sure he commands the locker room as well as Aaron Rodgers says that he does. But Matt Nagy was able to command a locker room and command a clubhouse for a little bit in the locker room, and for a year. But that's not lasting, right? And what we need right now is a guy who has shown success consistently throughout his career and is able to bring that into this program that fits him, right? I think that's a hard thing for people to think about when it comes to, well, I'm looking for a new job, right? Do I fit the new job? Does the job fit you as well? That's a two-way street. This is, at the end of the day, this is just looking for a job, right? So we're making it more complicated than it needs to be, I feel sometimes. It's a guy with a resume looking for a new job. Company fits him, he fits the company, perfect match. There you go. It's really that simple at the end of the day, right? There's a lot of intangibles, there's a lot of details in there, but at the end of the day, it's just a guy looking for a job and a company that's hiring. Just happens to be a professional football team. So that's how our breakdown on Matt Eberflus, Byron Leftwich, and Nathaniel Hacket has been. Matt Eberflus, really great guy, really smart defensive coordinator, fantastic resume, definitely up on the list. Bears like him a lot, bring him back in for a second interview. Byron Leftwich, probably my number 2 overall. I think he's an incredibly exciting candidate. I think he's going to be a lot of help for Justin Fields and hopefully a lot of help for the Bears offense moving forward. Then Nathaniel Hacket, certainly a strong candidate, but maybe not that X factor, maybe not that appealing as some other names that we've reviewed are.
Yeah, absolutely. So anyways, guys, we're going to go ahead and get out of here, but make sure you're following us on Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram at FireSideBears. Make sure you're following myself and Maxx on Twitter at MaxSmithySM and at Usayd Koshal. Make sure you're subscribed to the YouTube channel as well as the podcast. We record episodes on Tuesday nights and then drop them Tuesdays at 11:59 p.m. Central Time. Also, guys, make sure you're locked into the FireSideBears YouTube channel this draft cycle. Okay, we're gonna have lots of prospect interviews on. I think I've got like 12 total interviews lined up so far, and we're not even in the thick of draft season. And guess what? 10 of those prospects have talked to the Bears. So we're gonna let you guys pick and choose which ones are talking to the Bears, because Mark Sadowski, they certainly do an excellent job in terms of finding the draft picks and stuff for Chicago. But bear down, peace out. We're going to go do a GM breakdown now after we take a quick break, but peace out, guys.